esta noche va a haber una ofensiva en todas partes. Pandillero visto como siempre, pandillero eliminado, que quede claro, camarada.
El Salvador, March 27, 2022. A massive surge of violence over the weekend, where 62 people were killed in a single day, the most for any 24-hour period in the last 30 years since the country's 12-year civil war ended, leaves the government no choice but to declare a state of emergency. This desperate move gives police expanded powers in the hope to somehow stop the violence in the streets of the country that have been taken over by warring gangs, most predominantly the MS-13, who control entire sections of major cities, and their rivals, the 18th Street Gang. These gangs have turned the streets into war zones where citizens and even local police feel helpless. But there's another element that has re-emerged in recent years that, instead of being afraid, has chosen to hunt down and eliminate these gangs.
En El Salvador esta noche los pandilleros están temblando de miedo. La Sombra Negra.
Y la Sombra Negra unir.
La Sombra Negra.
La Sombra Negra, última víctima de la Sombra Negra.
La Sombra Negra, Spanish for the Black Shadow, is a vigilante paramilitary death squad whose identities are unknown. They operate in secret, at night, dressed in black with masks, armed with military-grade assault rifles, and roam the streets in unmarked trucks and SUVs, looking for any gang member unlucky enough or unaware enough to be caught at night. They have no known leadership or central structure, preferring to remain in the shadows, lying in wait as the avenging angel of death for the gangs that control the streets of El Salvador, leaving only murals, messages, and bodies behind. To understand the emergence of the Sombra Negra, we have to go back to their roots and those of the MS-13, both of whom emerged out of the El Salvadorian Civil War, a 12-year conflict from 1979 to 1992 that ravaged the country, as the government forces fought against an umbrella of left-wing guerrillas in a war that resulted in at least 75,000 dead, with at least another 8,000 disappeared. The war also displaced a massive amount of citizens who were forced to flee from the violence. Many of those citizens immigrated to the United States, settling in Los Angeles in the Pico Union neighborhood of the city. There, the immigrant Salvadoran community established themselves, and the MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha, were born. It initially began as a group of Salvadoran immigrants who protected the small community, but later evolved into a street gang that began to rival the other street gangs of Los Angeles. In the early 1990s, immigration policy by then-President Bill Clinton began to result in large numbers of MS-13 members who were Salvadorian nationals being deported back to El Salvador. Once back in El Salvador, the MS began taking over, their numbers exploding, and with it, the levels of violence on the streets they began to completely take over. San Miguel, El Salvador, 85 miles east of the capital, 1994. With levels of violence at highest since the Civil War ended and the country being terrorized by MS-13, several citizens in this major city decided to do what the police couldn't, and the Sombra Negra was born. In the late summer of 1995, police arrested 16 people who were alleged members of the Sombra Negra in response to 20 gang members being killed over the previous few weeks. Among those arrested were 4 police officers, 2 prominent businessmen, and even 1 evangelical priest. Salvadorians in the country and outside of it rallied to their defense, clearly supporting the group that was fighting back against the gangs that terrorized the cities. Later that year, that support from the community would have a major impact as the courts of San Miguel set 7 of the suspected members free, including 2 of the police officers, due to lack of evidence. The next year, 6 more of the 16 were also cleared of any murder charges, including the remaining 2 police officers. 2 years after the arrests, the last 3 were also cleared of charges and found innocent. Of the 16 arrested, not a single member was found guilty. In 1995, the Sombra Negra began making their presence known in the national media, as they sent a written document to major news stations where they stated their intentions to eliminate the gang members, as well as government officials that were considered collaborators. This written memo to the national media even included a hit list of judges that were accused of being collaborators or ineffective at bringing justice to the citizens of the country. As the Sombra Negra began to be more active, the murder rate in the country began to decline, as the gangs that were causing the violence began to fear violence themselves. As time went on, authorities in the United States began to crack down on MS-13 as well, declaring their own war on the gang. Along with the presence of the Sombra Negra in El Salvador, and the looming threat of deportation that gang members faced if arrested and convicted in the United States, the legal system began to see just how much the MS feared the Sombra Negra. The trend that most glaringly showed this, the MS members arrested in the US began to actively claim their gang associations, instead of denying it to avoid gang enhancement charges. The reason for this was to argue against cruel and unusual punishment, citing that if they were deported, they faced almost certain persecution and death at the hands of the authorities and Sombra Negra in El Salvador. Several gang members went so far as allegedly requesting their tattoos be removed before deportation, so as not to be identified as MS by the Sombra Negra and other groups once back in El Salvador. Even though the Sombra Negra's presence faded from the national scene as the early 2000s began, their influence had undeniably changed the dynamics in the streets. Little was heard from the Sombra Negra in the 2000s until early 2014, where they came back on the scene again by communicating through messages announcing their presence. Messages that appeared on leaflets, on the walls of the city, and next to the bodies they left behind as they once again began hunting MS-13 gang members throughout the country. In January of 2014, in the town of Suchitoto, the Sombra Negra violently re-emerged by stalking 7 gang members to a house where they were watching a movie and opened fire in the home. 3 of the gang members escaped, but the other 4 were captured, beaten, and killed. The style of the attack and how it was completed bore all the calling cards of the Sombra Negra. These violent statements continued through the mid-2010s as they began to make the national news, and thus the Sombra Negra were able to directly threaten gangs nationwide by the news reporting on these attacks. In 2016, a body was found on a road in a sack where a message had been written. Written on the sack was the message, "The Black Shadow is back, gangsters. Get ready. We are tired of terrorists." Similar messages and attacks were seen in other parts of the country, as another noticeable incident in 2019 in the town of Peroso de Osorio included a similar warning and promise. The Sombra Negra also emerged on social media, which they used to establish their own coverage of and promise of more attacks on the gangs, with images of the aftermath of attacks committed and suggestive posts containing assault rifles and cars that promised patrols the coming evenings. Almost all of the posts relating to these can't be shown on YouTube, and given the social media policies on harm and community guidelines, it's extremely surprising that they are still online. Today, the war between the gangs and the rest of the country continues, as seen by the recent state of emergency. However, this time, the surge in violence will likely be met in kind by the citizens and vigilantes in El Salvador. According to human rights groups and the other agencies that track such statistics, the number of death squads in the country is only increasing, as warnings to the gangs and violence targeting them is rising every year, as the people of El Salvador fight to reclaim their country.